Hi, and welcome to Adventures in Relationship, a psychoeducational show about healthy relationships for adults with complex trauma. I'm Amy Gordon, an individual and couple psychotherapist working on unceded Tiwa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also offer virtual therapy, so reach out if you'd like to work with me individually or as a couple. For about a century now, the field of psychology has pointed to our mother's insufficiency as a primary source of mental health issues. I don't disagree, but there's a lot more to the story, including the psychopathological roots of trauma that stem from the systemic development and persistence of global white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist imperialism and colonialism. I'll be using the shorthand Great White Father to refer to this system in this podcast. The point of this episode is to clarify that although mothers, birthers, and breastfeeders of all genders are of primary impact on the mental health of their children, and this pertains primarily to those in that typical mother role because of the biology of symbiosis during infant development. But despite that, it's Great White Father's negative impact on those mothers that's the true cause of our suffering mental health. It's a setup. Child nurturers are forced into systems where they're under-resourced, traumatized, and ill-equipped to meet their child's emotional, developmental, and neurobiological and attachment needs, all of those needs. We know that hurt people, and we're talking about a system of transmission. So the aspects of Great White Father that have subjugated and exploited women and people of all marginalized status throughout history are the true cause of complex PTSD and insecure attachment and general mental health suffering. The message that our mothers have really bestowed upon us come from that system. So our mothers have been messengers of Great White Father's system. That message being, you're not innately valuable and you must prove your worth through sacrifice and self-abandonment for the ultimate benefit of Great White Father. You might be asking how this works, and there are books on the matter. I could probably write a whole book on the subject if I had the time and energy, but I'll try to stay focused on some simple concepts for the purpose of this episode. I do want to tackle relevant interrelated subjects like epigenetics, personality disorders, and patriarchy within the field of psychology in future episodes, though. It was just really important to me that I first acknowledge the truth of how the system has not given women and birthers of all genders a fair chance. So, just to back up and kind of share the general history, in Europe, prior to widespread intercontinental colonization by white men, subjugation and exploitation have long been a part of human history. Feudalism, the origins of capitalism, became the norm only after the rise of Catholicism and the so-called fall of the Roman Empire. About a century after the world's most popular Jewish mystic was assassinated for his social constructivist views and compassionate rejection of systemic oppression, a growing number of white men intentionally falsified the teachings of Yeshua simply because he had so many followers. And you could think of that as a little pre-social media hat tip. And of course, I'm talking about the dude who we in this society tend to refer to as Jesus. But appropriating his movement offered these original corrupt Catholics a certain credibility that empowered Great White Father's religio-political stranglehold on the masses. Feudal rulership, which is functionally akin to modern-day capitalism, quite frankly, rose to peak heights in Europe through the coercive manipulation, aka brainwashing, of the masses through fear-mongering, labor exploitation, and shame-based control. Very similar to kind of how things look in the US right now. And what I'm trying to point to is that Yeshua, what he had to say was really important to many people, and many people were devoted to following his teachings, and yet that information was usurped by those who were really trying to stand to gain political and financial power. So, of course, we know that there were uprisings and rebellions by those in Europe who couldn't abide the bullshit and servitude that was being thrust upon them. But that was really like the 99%. And they had little to no access to financial, educational, and agricultural resources, which were entirely taken by royal and religious jocks of the era. So, kind of same shit, different day. Even the Protestant Reformation was appropriated by pathologically disturbed monarchs who further manipulated Yeshua's message to justify the genocide of women. So, King James I, known for his Bible, also authored a book that functioned as a how to guide on quote unquote witch hunting. And that was about 100 years before the Salem witch trials of the US. Though a lot of whites fled Europe because of religious persecution, various forms of exploitation, and other social justice based reasons. There's something about today's hysteria regarding immigration that is certainly related to the projected powerlessness wounding around this. And yet, other whites did arrive in nowadays colonized parts of the world for less self-preserving reasons, all related to taking advantage of local resources. And without getting into super triggering details, that included all types of physical exploitation of human beings. But whether or not the Europeans arrived under duress, all became reenactors of duress upon others through forced displacement and genocide of people indigenous to the lands that they came to occupy. Once again, hurt people hurt people. So our ancestors either come from these lineages of suffering at the hands of slave captors, serial murderers, rapists, and abusers of every imaginable kind, or our ancestors, like many of mine, were those slave captors, serial murderers, rapists, and abusers of every imaginable kind, and likely some combination thereof. So I guess I just want to point to how a lot of people, at least around me and maybe resonate, are talking about how things are just the worst they've ever been in the United States right now. And I just call bullshit. And I encourage you to remember this if you think that things are the worst they've ever been in the US, especially if you're white. So, in each of our families of origin lies painful skeletons in the closet, and those don't just disappear over time. They're passed along generation after generation. And like the game of telephone, it might be hard to discern exactly what the original content was, but rest assured, your psychological suffering didn't arrive out of nowhere. And while there are numerous epigenetic factors that pass along trauma and stress reactivity, much of what is passed down is intergenerationally transmitted. In fact, a lot of what we're now learning about the genetics of mental health imply a both and regarding the nature versus nurture debate, in that genes flip or are activated or inactivated based on lived experience. So even though something is inherited, doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to manifest in your body and your psychology unless you go through a lived experience that actually triggers that gene to action. So I want to point to a phenomenon that occurred in the 1980s, wherein an alpha male, actually it was a group of alpha males in a troop of baboons that were competing with another nearby baboon troop for access to some human garbage as like a food source. And that baboon troop's alpha males all died of tuberculosis from infected human trash. And the remaining elderly and immature males survived with the females. They studied this baboon troop, and it's really fascinating what happened. It shifted the culture in their baboon society to significant increases in cooperation, collaboration, and a complete elimination of rape and interspecies murder. So even though the young males who grew up to be alphas, they discontinued the majority of aggressive behavior. And for generations, their society lived in greater peace, harmony, and safety as a result of the males never being violently socialized. So I guess this is just one example of how, we think that it's animal nature, it's human nature to be this way, that way, but we are socialized and we are conditioned and we are programmed so easily, especially as babies and as children. So, how do you imagine the female baboons were impacted by the temperament of the males in their society? I think it's a good question when it comes to the topic of this episode. Our mothers have been dealt a crappy hand. And if things were different, if Great White Father didn't have the same influence, the mothering might look different. So in the US, women couldn't vote until 100 years ago, and that's not a long time. Women of color couldn't really vote until the late 1960s. And it wasn't until after I was born in the 80s that women across the United States could actually divorce, at least without their husband's permission, which is whack. So women couldn't own property or have a bank account until about 50 years ago. And this is all very, very recent history. Throughout the colonized world, women having access to any of these basic rights is very recent history. I'm talking about, our mothers, our grandmothers, and don't doubt for a second that your emotional welfare and mental health have not been massively impacted by these women due to the men who have had explicit control over them. We've absolutely been impacted by the implicit biases and unconscious beliefs that come from existing in this manifestation of Great White Father. Another way to say this is that our mothers have been ill-equipped in their role due to systemic subjugation. In the future, I really would like to dedicate a whole episode to the subject of patriarchy in the field of psychotherapy. I already mentioned that, but it's just got me thinking. Anyway, among other issues, the field has massively confounded our lack of mental emotional well-being through targeting mothers as the source of our suffering, while ignoring that the most significant roots of our mama trauma comes from systems of men. So it was hard for me to really figure out how I wanted to apply this concept to just sort of exemplify how this happens. I decided to use attachment theory because I think a lot of people are really interested in attachment theory right now. So we'll take attachment theory as a framework for describing the transmission of relational trauma from the overculture to men, to mother, to child, rinse, repeat. So in dismissive avoidant attachment, usually referred to simply as avoidant, we know that the development of aversion to intimacy and commitment derive from a family culture in which autonomy is emphasized. Performance and appearance are the basis for esteem, and attachment values are generally derogated, and this results in emotional neglect. So they say attachment is hardwired by the age of 2, and whether or not that's entirely true, the traditional role of the mother is significantly more impactful than that of fathers and non-birthing parents for that reason. Whether or not that's exactly 2 years, infancy and the connection between infant and mother, or the person in that traditional mother role, being the breastfeeder, being a primary nurturer, etc. It's a matter of neurobiology, symbiosis in utero, full physiological dependence on breast milk, body heat, and care for all bodily functions compel infants to cling to their mother, mostly, at least initially. And very sadly, we know from Harlow's monkey studies that infants prefer a soft and warm embrace to even life-sustaining resources. We're hardwired for connection, and instinctually, babies orient toward the mother with an entitlement to care until or unless our instincts are repeatedly thwarted. And that's basically how avoidant attachment begins. Very early in life, avoidant attachers were conditioned out of their instincts toward connection, starting when they were in need of maternal symbiosis, oftentimes. So other factors, of course, war, inadequate healthcare, orphanages, baby scoop culture, out of wedlock pregnancy shame, and other religious and cultural factors severely affect emotional neglect and avoidant attachment. And all of these elements have been brought to us by Great White Father. Oftentimes, mothers who emotionally neglect their children are anxious about responsibility and criticism. The values of obedience, compliance, and subjugation inspire them to defer their maternal instincts to the so called experts, usually white male doctors who have discouraged physical affection, informed mothers that formula is better than breast milk, and encourage the cry it out method in order to foster emotional self sufficiency. Avoidant attachment continues to form through a developmental context that reflects Great White Father's emphasis on independence, achievement, superiority, stoicism, and conditional self worth. Avoidant attachers are prone to perfectionism, loneliness, isolation, and ever present social anxiety at their core. They also, at their core, they don't believe that they're deserving of love and devotion because it's only their superficial characteristics that were affirmed in childhood. So there's this real lack of sense of valuable core self in avoidant attachment. And of course, they don't really know how to offer unconditional love and devotion to others as a result of that. They haven't experienced it. In traditional psychoanalysis, certain neuroses like anal retention were attributed to cold and judgmental mothering, i.e., dismissive avoidant. Anal retention, as many of you know, is associated with a compulsive need to control one's environment. But the term comes from the theory that early in life, that child implicitly learned to hold in their biological waste so as not to upset an already distant mother. While Freud's theories have largely been debased, there's something to be said about how impactful mothers are, certainly on early neurobiological development, but also in the organizing of neurology and mental emotional complexes throughout the developmental years. But mothers were never meant to go it alone. The positive impact and mitigating nature of supportive co parents, extended family, and community members can't be understated. As a matter of nature, mothers are simply not capable of providing for all infant child needs on their own. They need other humans to resource them. Humans are herd animals. We're social creatures, we're interpersonal creatures, and this is perhaps the most devastating aspect of Great White Father's impact on our emotional welfare. Colonized culture is isolating. Men are expected to work and provide outside the home, leaving mothers alone with postpartum exhaustion and very little time to recover and connect with their infant before they're expected or forced by necessity to return to work. And most infants in the colonized world are deprived of necessary and consistent face to face, skin to skin contact with their first primary attachment figure, a prerequisite for secure attachment. While avoidant attachment is a fairly direct result of the overculture's values, the other two insecure attachment styles are less directly reflected, but still certainly a byproduct of Great White Father's overculture in a more reactive process. And that's exactly how we learn to interact with others, by developing reaction and defense or through emulating modeled behavior, one or the other. So, the context that leads to anxious attachment, also known as anxious ambivalent or preoccupied, can be summarized as overall patterns of parental overwhelm and intermittent reinforcement of emotional attachment needs. Infants who develop anxious attachment experience excessive frustration with first their mothers for not being consistently available for soothing them and attuning to their needs. They learn that they need to vocalize loudly and protest separation because sometimes it actually works for motivating their mother to pay more attention to them. These mothers are often overwhelmed, depressed, and under resourced. So, when infants exhibit powerless distress, as they all do, the mamas of anxiously attached children find it particularly distressing due to their own powerless distress. And of course, that comes from struggling to survive in Great White Father's world. These mothers generally have a basis of valuing attachment, but they really struggle with the demands of motherhood. And unfortunately, like with avoidant attachment, a fear based self fulfilling prophecy occurs in anxiously attached little ones. Their signals of distress overwhelm their already preoccupied mothers to the extent that they're less capable of effectively responding and soothing. Anxious attachers reenact their relationship frustration in adulthood too. They obsess about primary relationships due to the intermittent reinforcement of connection in childhood. Their nervous systems are hardwired to experience anxiety when they're feeling disconnected, and they tend to suffer low self esteem, believing that they're not safe unless their attachment figure is pleased with them. They explicitly worry about rejection and abandonment based on the implicit memory of not being predictably responded to when they were entirely dependent. This explicit worry results in loud protests and complaints of their partner's lack of care for them. Their fixation amplifies the frequency and intensity of their feedback, often pushing their partners away. They struggle to feel safe and satisfied in relationships, leading to depression, which is exacerbated by not really knowing who they are or what they want, a result of habitual orienting toward their attachment figure in an attempt to connect. Separation and abandonment anxiety, depression, low self esteem, and relational preoccupation result when our mothers want to love and nurture us, but they're overwhelmed by the demands of society. And then the third insecure attachment style, disorganized or fearful avoidant, is similar in origin, but primarily differentiated from anxious attachment by the severity of unresolved trauma in the caregiver's life, which is then passed down to their child. This mother is so severely overwhelmed by her internal state or external circumstances that she can neither sufficiently nurture or protect her child from harm. The avoidance of a disorganized attachment style is rarely from the same type of hypercriticism and overvaluation of independence that you see in dismissive avoidance. It stems from forced self sufficiency in the face of danger, as in these babies and children did not have anybody to protect them and they had to learn to take care of themselves, or at least not consistently and not sufficiently protected. Exposure to trauma and extreme instability due to parental addiction or severe mental illness or literal abandonment, or even a lack of supervision that tends to precede victimization by predators, those are all common childhood experiences of disorganized attachers. It's a dog eat dog world where trust no one has to become the mantra for survival for these folks. They long for love and connection, but primary attachment relationships activate strong survival defenses, making stable adult relationships very hard to come by without intentional healing and relational work. Relationships are a landmine of triggers for folks with disorganized attachment. They often exhibit paradoxical behavior like distancing when they want closeness and becoming volatile when they want distance. They struggle with cognitive dissonance in romantic relationships and are more prone to unconscious relational sabotage than the other insecure attachment styles. These folks often carry massive emotional wounding, but their defensive doubts are a strong barrier to getting help. And that deep mistrust of life in general leads to missed or self sabotaged opportunities, accumulated regret, and strong self deprecating tendencies. Reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited attachment disorder, which is more common in females, are caused by this brand of attachment rupture. As well as anxiety and depression, disorganized attachers often suffer from conduct and explosive disorders and struggles to launch and gain traction in the human instinct to individuate and actualize their lives. Now, of course, not all disorganized attachers have experienced such severe neglect or exhibit such extreme characteristics in relationships, but many have and do. These wounds are not the result of happenstance. They come from similarly oriented parents, particularly mothers, who didn't have access to the resources they needed to stabilize and develop a capacity for being a competent parent. And no matter how you slice it, The reason they didn't have access to sufficient resources is a byproduct of the most severe aspects of our sick overculture. Great white father is the cause of your mama trauma. So when you feel the urge to blame your mother for her lack of maternal capacity and the suffering you've experienced as a result, don't think for a second that her insufficiency isn't rooted in patriarchal exploitation inflicted by men. I love this saying, Eve was framed. It's such a blasphemous yet succinct expression that implies this point. Now, please take note that I'm not expressing anything directive regarding your relationship with your mother. I'd love to do another episode on the growing outrage around no contact and parental alienation, but I probably talked enough for today. So let me mention one last amendment to everything I just said. There's a difference between understanding and forgiveness. I want to help you understand, and I'm not asking you to forgive your mother. Maybe that's something that would be helpful at some point, but premature forgiveness is simply self suppression. With complex trauma comes a premature ego in arrested development. And you can't actually forgive until you have clearly understood your trauma, felt all the complexities of your grief, and expressed the depths of your somatic trauma in some way. Anything else is just spiritual bypass. I've never met a client or anyone else for that matter who has found true solace from their emotional suffering by denying the impact that their parents, and particularly mothers, have had on them. Ego development and trauma recovery are necessary precursors to true forgiveness. So don't put the cart before the horse, so to speak. Focus on your own healing first, and maybe down the road, forgiveness is something that you'd like to work toward. Maybe not. I have no opinion on that matter for you, but do get help, get help figuring out your own relational trauma, and do that online or do that locally. And, I guess the same as usual, I'll say that I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist, or at least probably not. Some of my clients listen, but I do also want to mention 12 step. And there is a 12-step group for estranged parents called Parental Alienation Anonymous, or PAA. They have some in-person groups in rare locations, but they're internationally accessible and free to attend online. So if you are a parent, or if you know a parent who could use that resource, great. And of course, ACA, or Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families, can be a great option if you're wanting to heal from parental incompetence. As per usual, don't rely on podcasts or webcasts as your primary mental health support. Take good care of yourself and your partner if you're committed. You don't need to abandon yourself to do so. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this podcast today. My mission is to help adults with complex trauma find emotional freedom and learn how to thrive in relationships. So if you can take a moment to follow, rate, review, or share this episode, it is immensely helpful. Thank you for watching or listening. Until next time.